coming to you tonight in collaboration with Thinkspace. The IGP and Thinkspace have done a number of events together actually, and we very much appreciate in the IGP the intellectual support and comradeship of Thinkspace in this area of work on cities, and indeed in collective public goods, and in general in the work on arts that we do together. So it's great to see you all here. My name is Henrietta. I am the founder and director of the Institute for Global Prosperity, and it's my pleasure this evening to be introducing our rather wonderful panelists. So let me just explain first that the actual presentations will be live streamed onto Facebook, but the questions will not. So those of you in the audience who feel shy do not need to worry that you're going to be starring in the show on Facebook, because you're not. But just so that you know that that is happening. I also just want to say that what's going to happen is that we're going to have presentations from our three panelists, whom I will introduce in a moment. They're going to talk for about 15 minutes each. There's going to be a short chat between the panelists so that they can disagree with each other wildly. And then this will be your moment to come up with a question, so that we will then turn to you and ask you to join in. So before I introduce them, I just want to say a little bit about the importance of our cities and the changing nature of the infrastructures in them. One of the things that's really clear to all of us is that the cities of the future have got to be greener, much more resilient. Actually, they've got to be quite different kinds of spaces. But the problem about infrastructures is that infrastructures very rarely arise de novo. They're built on other infrastructures that were there before. And they're also connected in memory and in history and in identity and in culture to all those infrastructures, whether they are physical or material, whether they are emotional, whether they're data infrastructures, whether they're different kinds of infrastructures, like long-running forms of engagement with language and with space and with place. So when we talk about the shaping of our urban cultures and our forms of communication and engagement that we all have within the urban realm being shaped by infrastructures, we're beginning to ask this word infrastructure to do a lot of heavy lifting for us. And one of the questions tonight, I think, is can it really do that amount of heavy lifting? In other words, we talk about infrastructure so that everything now becomes an infrastructure. One of the things we're very interested in the Institute for Global Prosperity is in the question of infrastructures of care and the way in which new understandings of infrastructure of care are going to have to shape the built environments that we all live in. Just to give you an example of why we think that's so important, there are more than 60 million people on the move in the world at this moment. And as they move, that movement becomes the new normal. And the new normal of that movement brings out in others who have their own histories and cultures and identities, ways of engaging with the places that they know well. Various kinds of emotions, and many of these emotions are very deeply felt, but many of them are closely allied to forms of rage and exclusion. And those problems about rage and exclusion begin to animate new shapes, which in the first instance had nothing to do with that rage and exclusion. But as they emerged, the rage and exclusion began to delineate the space that they take within the city. And so suddenly lots of things which were not formally connected to each other suddenly become part of a common threat. So there's a huge problem in understanding how these forms of infrastructure work and how we're going to build new infrastructures of care and new infrastructures of culture and of identity, new kinds of history, in these new spaces that we know we have to create for our future in terms of tackling climate change and doing so much else as we become increasingly urbanized. So I think that's quite enough from me, but it gives you some idea of what we've been up to in the Institute for Global Prosperity. And I want now to just very briefly and quickly introduce our three speakers. I'd like to start by introducing Professor Irit Rogoff, who's sitting to my immediate right here, who is Professor of Visual Cultures at Goldsmith. Irit and I have known each other on and off for quite a long time, and I'm a very big admirer of her work on geography, globalization, countercartography, and various kinds of issues to do with the practice of theorizing in complex spaces and places, and what kinds of curation goes on around those kinds of theorizing. So Irit is going to speak first. She's going to be followed then by Suzanne Hall, who's Associate Professor in Sociology and Director of the Cities Programme at the London School of Economics. I can claim a little comradeship with Susie because in one of my former incarnations I was Deputy Director of the London School of Economics, and the Cities Programme was one of the things that we managed to pull off at that time, for which we are very grateful. Susie's work, of course, is about the intersections of global migration and urban marginalization. It's, of course, therefore about inequality and discrimination, but also about the kinds of streets and places, the familiar forms of the urban take that we encounter every day. And then our third and final speaker tonight, right around just brilliantly lost, is John Bingham-Hall. Sorry, John. And again, John is the director of Theatrum Mundi, which is a kind of cultural space for exploring many of the issues that we've been talking about. It's a charitable research centre. He's just told me that they've won a new grant, and so they've recently doubled in size, so congratulations. His team works on programmes of cultural infrastructure, on sonic urbanism, on choreography, basically looking at the relationship between technologies, performance, media, and infrastructure. And so now what I'm going to do, having welcomed our visitors, is ask you to welcome them by clapping, please, to be this tonight. And I'll give it to take over first.
Working? Okay, so thank you to the IGP and to Henrietta for your introduction. And I suspect that we don't disagree with each other at all, but I do suspect that we take up the notion of infrastructure for very, very different ends. And in a sense, it's not a case of a term that has become a hold-all for absolutely everything, but it's an indication for the ways in which people from different fields are in constant search for other ways of working, as we recognize the degree to which how we know how to work is insufficient to what we're trying to deal with. And so the migration of terms across fields is often not a question of a kind of fashionable latching on to a term, but I think a rather desperate move to try and figure out how, if you reconfigure the sort of the questions and the materials and the encounters, you might actually be able to open up a new scene within a set of preoccupations. I come from a very, very different milieu to, I think, the Institute of Global Prosperity, which is visual cultures. And visual cultures is a field, slightly invented field, and it is the meeting ground between contemporary creative practices, the political and the philosophical. So this is how I think of visual cultures, as this kind of meeting ground in which the relations and the power relations between these components shift all the time. The very brief presentation that I'm going to be doing here has to do with a project that we developed as the Free Thought Collective. This is the Free Thought Collective. We're an occasional collective. We come together in response to large-scale invitations to sort of put forward something that is discursive, performative, creative, and political in oblique angles. And this went through a series of festivals and events and so on, and ended up as the commission for the, let me just see if I can do this, yeah, for the Bergen Assembly. Bergen Assembly is a Norwegian triennial, and it happens every 3 years in the city of Bergen. Like most cultural activities in Norway, it's immensely well funded and supported, which meant the possibility of doing something very experimental. Now, our sort of delving into infrastructure over a period of, I'd say, about 5 years, was very conscious of the need to begin to produce another set of narratives that somehow took on the dominant narratives of infrastructure, which were tales of political economy, focusing on delivery of the visibly and seemingly necessary. So one of the first things we encountered as people coming out of the arts, anthropology, logistics and management studies, performance studies, which is kind of the general area of who we are, urbanism, was to start thinking about how infrastructure operates as the seemingly neutral and efficient delivery of everything that is absolutely necessary to us. So that seemed like the sort of degree zero of how infrastructure was being thought about around political economies, and that it was that needed troubling. And equally, the counter-narratives of hidden circuits between the seemingly innocent and the diabolically planned equally seemed to need a certain amount of troubling. I think very central to the inquiry was Kara Easterling, obviously, and her thinking that between objects, that infrastructure exists between objects of positive consequence, shape, and law. So the sort of notion that one could translate the language of resources, of capital, of urban mass, into notions of consequence, shape, and law was something that was extremely kind of stimulating to us. And it was particularly stimulating to us because it provided a place from which one could think, I think, against the grain of Henri Lefebvre's legacy of space always existing within the tension between material realities and psychic subjectivities. And so that kind of duality, which we came to through Lefebvre, was something that really needed a certain amount of nuancing and troubling, and infrastructure, as we began to understand it, following on from Easterling. And I think the thought of Easterling's that has been kind of central is that infrastructure is now the overt point of contact and access between us all. Now, I said that visual cultures, the field I come from, is a contact zone between the political, philosophical, and creative practices. And this, of course, tallies very closely with the body of thought that has been immensely important to us, which is the work on singularity. C, Giorgio Agamben, Felix Guattari, etc., from the Berardi. And the notion that everything that happens passes between us. So the kind of thickening of texture in terms of interactions that can't be tied down purely to the material, purely to the subjective, purely to the human, purely to the imaginary, but that notion that everything that happens passes between us, and it's the passing between us that we need to texturize and to begin to understand as a series of designs. The other aspects of infrastructure that interested us greatly, and I'll take you through a whirlwind of images in a minute, but without any explanation, because I don't really have time for it. But there's a website, you can sort of look at it all on the website. The other aspects were how to begin to think about certain kinds of affective textures as forms of infrastructure. So the degree to which certain kind of, let's say, radical histories within institutions, which seem to have absolutely no overt traces in these neoliberal times, in which things have been homogenized and metricized, etc., how they nevertheless constitute an infrastructure of substance that runs through the institution, even though it's almost impossible to capture. And so we also tried our hands at thinking through that. Or infrastructure, or friendship as infrastructure. As we begin to kind of think our way out of the limitations of how institutions structure our lives, our thinking, our ability to work, we think more and more in terms of the alignments of friendship and how that becomes a kind of substitute infrastructure. And finally, the great attraction of infrastructure is, I think, as a way of addressing a central conundrum within critical theory today. So within critical theory today, we're suspended between two and largely opposite, contradictory logics. One has to do with the inevitable universality of the subject of critical theory. The subject of critical theory is always universal. And the other has to do with the absolute imperative to look closely at localities, to understand the dynamics and the conditions which make up localities. And the absolute impossibility of aligning these two is at the heart of the crisis of critical theory today. And you see people like Elizabeth Povinelli doing amazing intellectual acrobatics and with thick, dense texture, the ethnographies of localities coexist with discussions of Kant and Heidegger. And very subconsciously playing out that kind of immense contradiction. So for all of these reasons, and for an understanding that the one thing that can somehow negotiate the gulf between the kind of the universal subject of critical theory and the immense imperative of looking at the conditions of localities is infrastructure. That infrastructure not framed by place, by nationality, by economy, is the one device that we have found to think through those relations. So this has been Free Thought's interest in infrastructure. And what I have here is this is the diagram with which we applied for the project. We didn't apply with a list of artists, we weren't interested in curating art. We were interested in how we might curate a concept in a relatively small city in which it might actually be possible to curate a concept rather than to put on a spectacle. And so there are a variety of activities. For 2.5 years we ran a city seminar. This was an open forum which anyone could register for. The reading lists were online and they were hosted by civic institutions in the city. Followed by a dinner to which we invited the entire city of Bergen, which often came, and lectures by people we invited to unpack in a more accessible form whatever it was we had been talking about in that week's seminar. And exhibitions and cafes and so on. This is the kind of statement. Trying to put infrastructure at the heart of determining spaces, disciplining bodies, allocating resources, and privileging notions of progress and development without any critical interrogation. We also recognize that infrastructural arguments were at the heart of certain kinds of operations around culture. And so operations such as Tate Modern that were producing groups of patrons who would then buy for the Tate works of art from the countries that they had come from, that had been colonized by Britain, and from which the Tate recognized what it very diplomatically terms as gaps. Gaps in our collection, and we have to fill them, and it's the formerly colonized patrons of art who would fill those gaps. One of the sort of sets of arguments that underwrite this request is an infrastructural argument. There are the buildings, there's the scientific knowledge, there are the climatic conditions, there is the exposure to audiences, which means that this art will do better and have more impact here than it will at home. And so resources are diverted from beginning to build cultural infrastructures elsewhere in order to fill the gaps of a cultural infrastructure here. And this is a sort of argument that is of course attached to notions of cultural value and notions of cultural heritage and cannot be separated from it in any way. This is the old fire station in Bergen. It was offered to us as one of our sites. We were told it was empty. When we arrived, it was full of the retired firemen of Bergen who were militantly striking and occupying it because they wanted it to be a museum of fire. Bergen is built of wood. It burns periodically. The firemen are its heroes. They save the city every decade, and they want a museum of their heroic activities. And the city wanted to turn it into a conference center. And so we thought about it, and we started working with them, and we built a museum of fire. So one of to turn fire into an infrastructural narrative seemed like a really good. I'm not going to, I don't want to weary you with details, and I don't have time. This started as a project of 6 people. By the time we finished, we were 42. We kept bringing in more knowledges, more agilities, not just expertise, but really agility of how to work with communities, how to sort of set up certain things. The This is the last oil rig built off the shore of Bergen. Bergen was at the heart of offshore drilling for oil. Norway's wealth is built on oil. The oil is finished. One of us was long on and did a project called The End of Oil. And this is the last oil rig, and he worked on it, made a film with the various groups of people. He showed it as a documentary film, but he also handed the material over to Phil Collins, who's an artist and filmmaker, and Phil made a dystopian manga film around the fable of the end of oil. And so one of the things we kept trying to do is take things and displace them and have them look at in different sort of perspectives. This is the Partisan Cafe, which one of us reconstructed. I don't know if you know the history of the Partisan Cafe in London. Late 50s, early 60s, this was the hub of British left-wing intelligentsia. It was non-partisan, and it was the sort of place in which many of the British left's major projects were generated. We decided to recreate the Partisan Cafe as a kind of site of a certain kind of regeneration. These are just some images from the Partisan Cafe. This is Charismatic Megafauna, which is a girl punk drummer band from London, which is one of the many things that were going on in the cafe all the time. This was a series of archives that we decided to try and animate. So this is the archive of the Partisan Cafe. Sorry, I just need to go through. This is an archive of the Shiraz Persepolis Festival, which was a 10-year cultural festival in Iran, run by 10 Marxist intellectuals and patronized by the Empress Farah Diva, the greater contradiction we could not find, and in which certain conjunctions of cultural presence from the West and from emerging decolonizing nations came together in ways that were truly astounding and didn't happen anywhere else in the world in 1970. So this was a sort of very, very important hub from emergent kind of decolonizing cultures and ones that were considered hegemonic. This is an archive that I've been making. It's called an Anecdotal Archive of Exhibition Lives. And it's a series of interviews with people from around the globe about an experience of an exhibition that transformed their consciousness. And they are not in any way iconic exhibitions or central places, but from the kind of places where an exhibition might actually transform their consciousness. This is an archive of the seminar that we taught over the years that we were there, collection of the readings. And finally, and I'll end here, this is one of the chapters, Shipping of the Shipped. This is Stefano Harney with a huge group of people that eventually were enlisted into this, trying to sort of think about shipping, global industry in which Norway is very central, and Bergen is very central, as as enabled by early moments of global shipping as slavery, and by the impossibility of thinking shipping without thinking the ship. So the notion of moving cargo, which has to be kind of returned constantly to a global notion of a seamless global notion of the industry of shipping. So he worked with many people who developed aspects of what happened when the ship got wherever they got to, and what then sort of developed. So, is a film that Denise Ferrer de Silva and Arjun Neumann made, and it's become the first in a series of films that they're making in islands around the world that have been somehow affected by the ship. And this is we decided instead of an opening, which is what you would have for an art exhibition, to have a summit, the infrastructure summit, to bring a lot of knowledges together. But we put it in the hands of Adrian Heathfield, who's one of us, and he turned it into a performance piece without us even realizing. He was the director, we were the actors. It was a script that we followed there. And it, I think, was partly to do with temporal modalities of everything being slowed down. These are just some images from the infrastructure side. So that very briefly is infrastructure from the perspective of visual culture.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Would it be possible to turn the cold air, like the noisy cold air? Are we in control of the noisy cold air? Certainly not. Sorry. Designed by architects. Thanks very much to Hannah and to Jeremy for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I need to speak up a bit. What I want to try and do tonight in this brief time slot is firstly to think through with you a 3-year period of research where we will be exploring migrant microeconomies on streets in cities where jobs are hard to come by and where the state impacts of austerity governance are hard felt. And while there's a long history of migration and the formation of these industrial cities, so we went to Birmingham, Leicester, Bristol, Manchester and London, our research also intersected with an acute period in British political history. So we were looking at a time and a place and a people that were living through the after effects of the 2014 Immigration Act, which John MacDonald had referred to in Parliament as the most racist piece of legislation that this government has ever passed. Together with the general election, together with the Brexit campaign, and on top of that, the resonance of the 2008 financial crisis. And the comparative device was really interesting for me personally, because previous to this, I had been engaged in ethnographic projects where I would go to a place for 3 years. And now we were hopping across a number of cities over a 2-year period. And there were some empirical conundrums that emerged. One of the things emerged that most of the traders on the street had never been traders prior to setting up shop. They had other kinds of occupations. They had driven a bus, they had worked in the post office, they had been a teacher, they had been an engineer. And so why had a particular group of individuals all ended up as street traders in the poorest parts of the city? The other interesting thing is that these streets are global and multicultural compositions in the sense that these are not constitutions of a Little Italy or a Chinatown. These are places where someone from Uzbekistan is setting up shop next to someone from Ghana, next to someone from Cape Town. And so some of these questions emerge as to what kind of economic life is possible, but also what kind of politics is possible. What happens when things go wrong? So the terminology of infrastructure, but perhaps more specifically the terminology of the edge, has become really important for me to think through three aspects that I want to share with you tonight. The first is the question not only of where displacement and emplacement occur, but also who violence locates. And this is the frame of place that Irit referred to. I also want to refer to the global constellation of centrality and marginality as a dual interplay of not only space making but also of race making, the forms of political economy that really sustain the separation and segregation. And finally, I'd like to explore the age as an infrastructure of simultaneous subjugation and subversion. And I don't have the confident eloquence of Irit, so I am going to rely on reading some of this. Within the vast complex of dehumanization that has come to comprise the European border complex, streets in the far-flung parts of cities are perhaps the most banal of infrastructures. Neither the camp, nor the detention center, nor the Mediterranean, streets remain attached through everyday formations to the ethos of discrimination that is integral to the contemporary migration system. Streets in the edge territories are one essential component in a multi-scale geography of centers and margins, a commonplace stretch from which to understand migration as part of much longer histories of violent social sorting. My research on street economies forged by migrant proprietors in UK cities, the ones that are the dark dots on this map, Birmingham, Bristol, Leicester, London and Manchester, which are also the cities that are the highest recipients of migration, surfaces how a heterogeneous range of individuals have become seemingly homogenized in terms of their work prospects, but also in terms of their urban locality. Despite significant differences in origins, in journeys, in occupations, and in education, these migrant proprietors had all become traders in parts of cities where jobs are hard to come by, and the impacts of state underinvestment are hard felt. This raises the question, the elemental question, of how race maps onto place in terms of how certain migrant groups are positioned in the city. When Ruth Wilson Gilmore, that fantastic geographer from the States, asks us to comprehend the racialization of space endemic to capitalist economies, she prompts us to consider how the multiple scales, which are always temporal and spatial, locate the long solicitation of racial violence, call to state building, and I would argue to city building. Infrastructure allows us to place processes of social sorting in space and in time, to locate global displacements in relation to urban emplacements, to think about the violence of here and now through infrastructure is to specify much more acutely where violence locates and more essentially who violence locates. While cities may have multiple centers and margins, the margin is not always a physical periphery, but it is always a structural and psychological edge territory. Bell Hooks proposes that to be in the margins is to be part of the whole, but outside the main body, evoking how margins form outside of, but always in sight of the center. Hooks asserts the simultaneous limitations and possibilities of this human and territorial position through the struggle of the relative meanings of centers and margins. I'm going to flick through four similar images that are really a process of us walking the street, speaking to all the proprietors on the street, and in the first instance, mapping their countries of origin. The current brutal intersection of global migration and urban marginalization brings into play wider political economies of centrality and marginality, in which the hierarchies of race are core to citizenship status. In the economic and cultural compact of what counts and who matters, centrality is constituted not simply as a locality, but as a relation of power. Centrality and marginality are always in the making with respect to one another. Central infrastructures require their own forms of segregation, secured through tacit and explicit codes that secure privilege as much as enforce exclusions. In our milieu of populism and profit, centers centres command a preeminent status measured against a globally extensive infrastructure of centrality and claims for advantage. Hierarchy is used to sustain the illusion that margins are the subsidiaries of centres, that informality is distinctive from formality, that provision is without provisionality. The entanglements of centres and margins suggest that infrastructure emerges as a relationship of politics and culture, physicality and perception, regulation and atmosphere. In conceptualizing the line formations of a black sense of place, a terrific article by Catherine McKittrick keeps sight of centre and margin. McKittrick engages with the enduring architecture of subordination that has shaped an economy of racial servitude, keeping black life in place, while rendering black life as placeless through the dispossession of self and of land. She underscores how the contours of a black sense of place are conditioned, but not circumscribed by subjugation. Thinking about the simultaneous subjugation and subversion of age infrastructures requires us methodologically and conceptually to veer off-centre, to ask what we learn about the city and about citizenship from the margins. The margins, pushed to the periphery by multiple forces of discrimination, potentially offer a place to be at risk, but also to take risk, to oppose and to reconfigure what Brooks names a profound edge. Engaging with the structural and psychological life of edge infrastructure allows us to explore the promise and limitations of occupying this marginal position. Structures of inequality and street racism feature prominently in the proprietors' accounts of where certain individuals and groups are consigned to settle, and the limited forms of work available in the margins. Yet expressions of cross-cultural agility and exchange were deeply significant to the proprietors' accounts of transactions. Many proprietors describe the multiple border crossings they have taken before arriving on the street, tracing their fragmented journeys over time period. So this is just a collection of a couple of proprietors' accounts of how they arrived at the Stapleton Road in Bristol. And what is alarming is that with the border escalation, people are having to spend 8, 10, 12, 15 years of their life moving across the globe, contending with one border and yet again contending with another. And what's interesting in this process, or the way it's narrated to us, is that with each border crossing, people have to acquire new repertoires, to learn a new language. You have to retake your occupation exams. You have to perpetually prove your legitimacy. And then when you make the next move, those forms of proof are rendered redundant. You have to start all over again. So there's also this terrific process of exhaustion, the bristle of waste that is built into the migration system. Many proprietors describe, with each crossing, these near-to-be citizens acquire a cosmopolitan repertoire of global edges, more languages, more skills, more upgrades, which perversely grows alongside their accumulated experiences of perpetual redundancy. So, for example, across all the streets that we've looked at now over a 6-year period, it would be very typical for a proprietor to speak up to 4 languages. These languages wouldn't simply be about regional proficiencies. These would be people who could speak Urdu, French, Spanish, and English. An indication not only of the arduous exercise of crossing the border and having to learn new skills, but also about a kind of multiculture that transcends the border in order to make trade and make business. What was also interesting is, for example, again in our street in Manchester, Cheetham Hill, 78% of proprietors had some form of tertiary education, and yet they had all ended up being proprietors on the street. So there's this incredible accumulation of varied skill sets that are now encrusting our streets in the edge territories, and it makes for really fairly astounding forms of commercial and political endeavour. To suggest then that there are different possibilities of citizenship within the realm of being outcast is to work with an extremely delicate brutality of ordering across contemporary Europe, and a kind of brutality that is, I think, very much saturated in the liberal construction of democracy, is so extreme. The fatalities and casualties are so appalling that it leaves little room to consider anything other than profound systemic recognition. I tread cautiously down the street, aware that I need to keep centre and margin in sight in order to understand marginalisation without it obscuring the view of meaning-making in the margins. In evoking the citizenship of the edge, I seek to open out the tight, highly localised conception of the ghetto, to explore the more expansive infrastructure of edge territories, the kind of infrastructure that is very much tied up with the day-by-day making. Our understanding of edge territories must therefore pursue the specificities of violence, the details of struggle, and the varied convolutions of everyday transaction. Thank you very much.
And now I'd actually like to jump in Hall to John, please.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I want to say a big thank you for the invitation. It's a real honour to speak alongside Susie and Irit. I've heard about their work in lots of different domains. Actually, I realised I knew more about free thought than I remembered. And Susie and I were colleagues previously in her work, as you'll see, I think, as I present some of this stuff. It's been a real kind of inspiration for some of what we've been doing. Yeah, to kind of, actually, as you were both speaking, you made me realise I needed to kind of take a step back from the beginning of my presentation to say a word about kind of how infrastructure has kind of been mobilised in my own work and in Theatrum Mundi's, and kind of why I think we had a big part of Theatrum Mundi's work is to kind of look at how and why different kinds of kind of cultural space are produced in the city and what they do, what kinds of performance, what kinds of making, what kinds of public life they bring about. And particularly in a workshop in 2015, as we compared two very different approaches to city making or to cultural space making, one from the ground up. We're talking about kind of the making of big cultural districts here, one from the ground up, one from the top down, realizing we were talking not just about making particular spaces, but of a whole set of kind of infrastructures that allowed cultural forms to kind of be produced in those spaces. So that's kind of one, that term of infrastructure emerged for us there, of a cultural infrastructure, which we then saw, as I'll show in a second, really coming out in political and planning discourse around culture, taking over from terms like cultural regeneration, which are kind of been discredited in many ways. And then simultaneously my PhD, which was about communication practice in relation to kind of the configuration of the built environment, this notion of there being an infrastructure for the public sphere, kind of, which actually framed in this panel, and I haven't kind of seen it framed so specifically in that way, but has been very much in my mind, so that's really interesting, was kind of coming to be a way of describing what I was observing in my own research in my PhD, the way that there's a kind of like process from particular kinds of materiality and configuration in the built environment to communication practices in and with and through those kinds of configurations with the addition of technologies, but then building out again into a kind of wider configuration of the public sphere, which is very difficult to kind of track against or observe as being directly related to the kind of everyday shape of the built environment. So that was another way infrastructure became important to me, is as a kind of bridge between this everyday shape of the built environment and then the way that kind of cultures and politics and patterns of communication at a much more kind of abstract and virtual scale emerge. So what I want to talk today about more specifically is kind of how we're developing this notion of cultural infrastructure in Theatrum Mundi, kind of touching on some of the theoretical reframing we've been trying to do, but then how we're trying to use that to frame some grounded research. And I also just want to say, this is really me speaking on behalf of Theatrum Mundi. This is a collective product. There are slides and research in this presentation by my colleagues Justine Trudion, Fanny Costeru, Andrea Satrulo, and Cecily Schwab, who have been working on this with me. And my previous colleague, Adam Casa, who co-authored this report, which I'll talk a little bit about, and some good copies of anyone like a souvenir of this wonderful evening. What's kind of part interesting about the word infrastructure is that it's historically actually quite recent. It was, created, it emerged, and as my colleague Justine noted, we didn't wait until the 50s and 60s to start building roads, bridges, and dams, but at that point started framing them as infrastructure, as something that sits underneath, even though, of course, many of these objects are huge and are kind of, in a way, superstructural scale from the human perspective. So that's to say that infrastructure, things get reframed as infrastructure for very particular reasons, whether it's to hide them, to make them hard to challenge, to justify the huge investment and the sometimes very violent socio-spatial reorganizations that they bring about, and often in the name of economic progress. More recently, as culture is kind of primarily being seen as a kind of economic activity, we shouldn't be surprised that the architectures, the forms it inhabits, should be reframed in the same way as infrastructures. But I want to challenge the very particular way that this reframing is happening. Since 2016, several kind of high-level planning strategies in the Anglophone world have emerged, particularly Sydney in New South Wales, one in Melbourne, and there's the current Mayor of London, City Economy, a campaign promised to develop a cultural infrastructure strategy with that very specific language for London also, which is still in development, and we're kind of in interaction with as well. And we're seeing this kind of terminology, cultural infrastructure, embedded into kind of political communication, as I said, replacing some of these past notions about how culture is planned for in the city. So what does cultural infrastructure mean at this kind of scale as a mode of city making? Well, taking the kind of New South Wales plan as an example, they talk very specifically about using it to demonstrate a commitment to arts and culture by delivering world-class cultural infrastructure, renewing the Sydney Opera House as Australia's premier tourist destination, and talking about needing to understand how much they're investing to see whether they're competing enough. This kind of represents the notion of infrastructure as a kind of heroic modernism, symbolic nation building, where here the city kind of stands in for the nation, but also these as infrastructures, not as just useful things, but as symbols of progress. What are called infrastructures, something like the Sydney Opera House, are of course very crafted cultural symbols intended to communicate about themselves as much as they are to be infrastructures for the delivery of cultures to audiences. And this relates to what Philip Larkin describes as the poetics of infrastructure, their seductiveness, their encoding of desired futures, progress. And so you can think of the so-called Bilbao effect as something like the stimulation of a desired future for a creative city through the making of mega-scale infrastructures as symbols of that future. And the mode of operation for this kind of poetic, infrastructural poetic is simple. Spend more than anyone else. Create a kind of myth of scale around these kinds of disinvestment. And this gives us a byproduct of a kind of industry of benchmarking and comparing investment in cultural infrastructure. So AEA Consulting has developed a cultural infrastructure index which ranks specifically museums, performing arts centres, and cultural hubs or districts by specifically level of expenditure. And kind of is a way for cities to understand whether they're kind of competing at this global scale of infrastructural investment. So what we see is the way that cultural infrastructure is being asserted in kind of urban planning and at a political scale, very much based in this kind of engineering notion of infrastructure, which Irit kind of critiqued also earlier. And its kind of ability at capturing a zeitgeist of the relationship between capital investment, economy, modernity, political value, and development. You're not developed until you have roads, bridges, public transport, but now you're not developed until you have a performing arts centre, a global museum. And it embeds the notion of also the built environment as a kind of whole that can be reconfigured from a kind of aerial perspective as a blueprint to be kind of, reconfigured technologically. So cultural infrastructure is founded in this notion of politics, but I kind of want to say that this definition is not fixed or inevitable. Infrastructure is always kind of constructed as a definition for a particular political purpose. and that actually a different definition is not only possible but really essential. If it's the cultural infrastructure is going to become a useful term for actually thinking about how cultural life is generated and supported in the city. So I want to talk a little bit about how we're trying to do that, particularly through the kind of critical rethinking of infrastructure that's emerged a little late in many ways from anthropology in the last kind of 10, 20 years, but interestingly that very much is a reaction to its establishment as a term in engineering and in planning, rather than it coming from this critical humanities point of view in the first place. So to kind of go back to basics of the term itself, looking at these kind of dictionary definitions can actually be helpful, because there's always this notion of it being a set of basic systems. Could the Sydney Opera House or Tate Modern really be considered basic systems and at the foundation of kind of cultural production or of labour, or are they more like rarefied objects that are the results of these processes? The base then, in kind of Marxist thinking, this basis of society is the means of production and the relations of production. So for me already, the notion of cultural infrastructure has to have in it the notion of production and of where and how labour takes place in the city, and very much seeing culture as the result of labour. Adding to that a kind of broader notion of production than of that of just artworks. So production in the fairest sense also being the production of knowledge, the production of social relations, the production of civilization even. So can we start to think of these modes of production having infrastructures, and I think that's where it links very much to Susie's work in that particular kinds of built environment might mean that people can produce new forms of new business practices, new kind of cultural practices that are brought with migration in a particular environment. And then this kind of production, reframing is the notion of poesis. Calhoun said in Shapiro's article, poesis means making, talking about infrastructures for a whole range of life, social practices, and urban cultures that could include legal arrangements, cultural conventions, financing systems, and so on. Adding to that, Susan Starr's notion, which Henrietta kind of touched on briefly, that infrastructures are not just objects, but conditions sunk into and inside of other structures, things whose characteristics are inherited from an environment, things grown and built upon other infrastructures, but then also that things no one person can fully be in charge of, because they are such a complex kind of assemblage of all of these influences. And as we kind of build this notion, build our kind of like, or cannibalize even our kind of armory of theoretical sources, adding in Ash Amin, the idea that if no one's really in charge, then who makes infrastructure? So contrary to the purposeful framing of infrastructures as too complex for individuals, for non-specialists, only comprehensible in technical realms, Ash Amin has shown how they can be lively, as he calls it, or collectively constructed as part of the discovery of shared life, talking particularly about informal urbanism and how basic services are put in place where there is no formal provision. And then Abdul Malik Siman's notion of people as infrastructure, where things like informal supply chains, marketplaces, and services become essential infrastructures for other activities, those have to be conceived as constituted by people. So we kind of build this, our own notion of cultural infrastructure, which in a sense is rather than trying to identify what is and what is not infrastructure, it's an infrastructural approach to looking at culture, which thinks about its supports as embedded into other structures, thinks about it in terms of the means of cultural production, the production of artworks as well as objects, knowledge, civilization, that it can be co-produced, that it can be constituted of people, etc., etc. But then we have a problematic. Can this kind of infrastructure really be designed in any meaningful sense when it's kind of so complex, so heterogeneous, so hard to draw a line around its edges as a kind of set of objects? And this was the question we asked in the first kind of stage of our research within Theatrum Mundi. Can we design the conditions for culture? Easterling becomes very helpful here again, and to framing why this is a problem for urbanists. Most urban architectural designers, she says, are trained to work on object forms or master plans rather than active forms, like all of these things that I've just been describing, the way that conditions, capabilities are embedded into the built environment, the way that people create kind of networks of practice. These are all active forms that are very difficult to design. We often get architecture instead kind of becoming a representation of production, the kind of aestheticization of production as a, or the fetishization of it as an aesthetic. And Easterling offers us instead things like multipliers, governors, interplays, topologies, wirings as terms that can kind of evoke particular approaches to design that don't design objects but play out across the city and increase its capacity for production. Wow, I'm going to run out of time, but I just want to touch very briefly on the way we've been kind of using this to frame some of our own research. So we really started, we wanted to ask, what are these conditions for cultural production and can they be designed? And the way we wanted to start looking at that was by thinking about the arts in the first place, and then trying to create some texture between different modes of cultural production. So for example, looking at how performances are produced, performances being dynamic forms that are interplays of bodies and objects in time that often, after their end, they kind of don't leave a trace. But a performance might be also a political hustings as much as it is a dance or music rehearsal. And the issues that we found, we did a series of roundtables with artists, issues for performers being these kinds of boring things that Susan Starr asked us to look at, like acoustics, bodily comfort, access times to a building, privacy, the number of bodies you can fit in that space, even the balance of friction and resistance in a floor surface for dancers. Then talking to makers, thinking of making as the transformation of materials from one state to another, usually using some set of tools. So it could be sculpture, it could be decorative crafts, as much as light industry or the mending of household equipment or cars. Usually this requires kind of long-term stability, the building up of tools and materials in a place, storage space, even something as simple as a door big enough to take deliveries through. And then we thought about virtual production. So the idea of communication through images, words, whether that be on paper or via screens, again, which could be writing a novel as much as political pamphleteering or graphic design. Not usually thought of as having a specialist infrastructure outside of kind of the new form of the co-working space, which is very much specific to kind of economic versions of this production. But people working in more kind of artistic or political ways rely on libraries, cafes, domestic spaces, even universities, and their infrastructures being broadband, power, even quiet, as tangible things, but then more difficult notions like their employment status, institutional like expertise, and the economic valuation of virtual objects, this problem of people not being paid properly for essentially publishing online. So this is kind of expanded on in much more detail in our report, but essentially we started to try and think of these things as a set of conditions that operate in the material realm, the immaterial realm, the ecological realm. Too complicated to go into the other bit. But that this infrastructural approach to thinking about culture needed, rather than thinking about these kinds of objects of culture, these symbols of culture, to think about these kind of boring, these backstage, these different kind of conditions which make different kinds of production possible in the city. One more minute? Just to, this is where kind of, we're doing a pilot study essentially on the next stage of our work. I won't have time to go into it in detail, but to try to then observe these conditions in specific sites, we're looking at Elephant and Castle as a case study, and we're looking at a series of different typologies within Elephant and Castle, shopping centres and purpose-built 19th century studios, and these railway arches are our kind of starting point. Interesting as a kind of like neutral carrier almost, well, not neutral, but a kind of empty carrier, almost like Arabena's Elemental project, but then kind of decisions about internal layout can be produced. So we're observing we have the Latin American businesses that kind of a very intense subdivision of the arches. This is very influenced by Susie's methodology to house a number of different spaces, a number of different functions, which, you know, I'm framing the idea is to kind of frame this as a space of cultural production, producing particular modes of eating, there's a jewelry maker, particular modes of cutting hair, for example, which happens upstairs. Comparing that to just a few arches down, you have purpose-built creative workspace, subdivided much more lightly. So just to say that kind of within this one kind of framework, there's the opportunity to produce different infrastructural conditions of modes of subdivision, of materialities within that produce particular conditions of acoustics and of size and shape of space, and that this shapes the kind of cultures that these can produce. This last example is a in a business park, that's the next set of arches is an equipment hire company for events. So they are the backstage of culture, and they're not framed within planning for the arts that kind of is dominated by this creative city model. They don't have a kind of public-facing element, but they are what is driving the ability to kind of have cultural events in the city. Just a last word, which is assemble. Various architecture practices did a kind of charrette, coming up with ideas for how to kind of do this infrastructural way of designing without designing these kind of object forms. And my favourite quote from it being, assemble arguing for providing buckets, not water, where water is the kind of culture that's to be carried by the infrastructure, but the bucket is the kind of space of possibility. Thank you.
Which was the highest property retail value in London, equivalent only to Knightsbridge, which was the highest property rental value in the world. Now you can do that not because you're really selling phones from your desk in front of the shop, because you're manipulating software, because wherever you had come from, you were trying to stand here. And so these incredible kind of reconfigurations of imagination, not just about physical space, but about different modes of tenure, how the migrant can run ahead of the property market. You know, I just found that really, the labour of reinvention, phenomenal thing.
I think, following from that, there's a tension between the notion of kind of allowing labour and then demanding it. And for me, labour here kind of almost being interchangeable with this notion of production, the right and the ability to produce new forms with and through your environment. All of so of the three kind of different ways of inhabiting those railway arches that I showed, two, we've been to start talking to these people. We're in literally a month into this new study, but two of them took the space as a blank space and did their own subdivision, and essentially Network Rail turned a blind eye to this, and there's no kind of permission that goes on. The third was kind of supported by the council and was kind of designed in a much more purposeful way. So you kind of have this difficult tension where, you know, the Latin American businesses have kind of been allowed to subdivide that space, but they've also had to subdivide that space in order to have an infrastructure that's accessible, whereas the kind of creative industries have been provided with a kind of space that's, you know, already been subdivided, but then at the same time, actually that kind of design, I think, has really misunderstood what those industries need. Their partitions don't go, this is kind of very down to kind of material details here, but their partitions are transparent, they don't go up to the ceiling, and the facade of the arch is glass. They're put on show to kind of perform the presence of creativity in that space. So you have this tension between the value of provision and then the kind of the kind of taking away of agency that's also done by provision. And I think in all of these discussions about kind of, you know, co-producing infrastructure, and we kind of have this danger of it becoming co-opted also by a kind of retreat of the state, and how you kind of balance that with the desire for kind of agency at a grassroots level.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it very much chimes with something else that I took away from the three presentations this evening, and that is that we often think of infrastructure, as several of you emphasised, all of you emphasised, as something to do with things that are immobile, that are either large or, you know, that are bridges or fixed things. But actually what you all talked about was the mobility of infrastructures, the things which are not there but can be drawn out of them. And what happens through that process of animating them in some way or other, and so that they appear as forms of constraint, but actually end up being ways of taking things forward. And that sort of took us in, I think, to issues around temporality and scale. Irit, do you want to pick up on that?
Sorry,
Yes, sorry.
I suppose, I think from the perspective in which we're thinking, one of the things that needs to be disrupted is the notion of infrastructure being able to deliver.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So one of the things we keep thinking about is the way in which infrastructure makes impossible rather than possible.
Yeah.
And I was surprised to find resonances of that in your presentation, John, because I think the dichotomy between creativity being driven by creative spirits versus creativity being driven by great conditions for creativity is a crock. I think as a kind of binary opposition, it doesn't begin to scratch the surface of the complexity of how certain kinds of intensities arise around conditions, and those are the terms we need, right? Not the perfect contexts or perfectly trained spirits able to fill them. So there's a way in which impossibility. I was really interested. I was in Australia recently for the first time and went around and saw all these kind of cultural infrastructures. And the thing that amazed me more than anything is how they weren't doing much. They weren't doing anything. They're just like beached whales everywhere, right? And that I think is really interesting. This seems to me that the kind of infrastructure is producing blockages and stoppages and impossibilities, and never sort of completing the circuit for absolute delivery is the aspect of it that I'm interested in.
I think infrastructure also has a vocabulary, and that vocabulary can be entirely accessible to power or entirely invisible to power. And so something that's really interesting on the streets that we've been looking at, a kind of creation of jobs in the poorest parts of the city where the jobs are not. And I know that a lot of these jobs are also in conditions of fragility. So it's part-time, it's casual, you don't get a pension. They're also immensely flexible. But we began to think a little bit about these streets almost as factory infrastructures. So a little bread and butter street that takes you 5 minutes to walk down typically will employ about 300 people. And when we went to the planners in Birmingham, we said, there's this Rookery Road, there's about 300 jobs, about 4 jobs per unit. So he said, we've got 77 Rookery Roads across Birmingham. So you multiply 300 by 77, and you're thinking 21,000 jobs ain't bad. No local authority is substantially investing in that as a form of significant infrastructure. The money's going into tech parks, Chinatowns, shopping centres. And so, part of our work is the work of translation to kind of animate the infrastructure to render it in some way visible to power.
Yeah, I think as we've all kind of touched upon, obviously, the kinds of analytical modes that we're in can start to make it a bit prism-like, where everything you look at you think is infrastructure turns out to have a whole set of other infrastructure. It kind of becomes, we're to some degree trying to make this tangible and usable as a challenging but quite pragmatic kind of mode of urban planning at a political level. Can this actually, at the point at which you start saying everything is infrastructure, that kind of becomes difficult. So in a way, for me, I'm starting to think of this more as a mode of analysis. So, it's just about always taking a kind of frame and then looking beyond and around and beyond, below, around it. But it's also beginning to seem to me like a way of looking at kind of what you touched on. What's a tool and what's a kind of finished product in the city? And of course, many supposedly finished things can become kind of challenged and turned into tools by the breaking down of their veneer, what we kind of call hacking, or I can't say, but so it's this. I think in many ways these large, very heavy institutions that kind of become very difficult to get into their administrative kind of systems, and this is what Suzanne and I are doing to talk about. That they become very hard for most people to kind of use to do anything. Not to say that they don't have a role, because of course there needs to be these possibilities for display and for encounters with a kind of much larger scale that then generate the desire for production. So I very much, you know, kind of, you're absolutely right, this notion that you can't just kind of create the space of possibility and that delivers. There has to be that kind of interplay between the intensity, the desire, the ingenuity, and the kind of creative drive, and that space of possibility. But so I suppose, though, focusing on the kind of infrastructural side, I'm seeing it as an approach that entails putting the framework for possibility of action in place, rather than a kind of like, you know, a receiving of finished things and an activity.
What Susie just said about the dichotomy between being visible or invisible to power, certain kind of infrastructures are either visible or invisible. I think there's a dimension to this that we haven't opened up, which is the degree to which the very notion of introducing something as infrastructural also links up with the culture of being calculable, right? So computation, calculability, preemption, they are deeply integrated into the invoking of infrastructure, not necessarily the recognition. And so partly I think we need to distinguish in our discussions between what we recognize as infrastructure, which is often invisible to power and invisible to knowledge, and that in which certain kinds of calculable outcomes are invested, which is highly visible to power and to knowledge. And so I think it's not a question of methodology only, although it is also a question of methodology, but it is the fact that infrastructure is now indelibly connected to computation and preemption.
Yeah, that's very important. Do you want, before I open up, do you want to say something quickly there? Yeah?
There is a who question in the computation, and sometimes we resort to tactics of computation simply to bring the who question more centrally to urban planning officials. So when John, for instance, mentions the arches, the middle-class white artists are given automatic legitimacy. They are cross-subsidized by the council in order to go and make art. The Latinos who are occupying the arches will be wiped out by the regeneration process. They will not be rendered significant in any shape or form politically, in terms of that level of politics. And so, you know, the kind of trickery that we also have to engage with, playing the calculation game in order to say, here's a validity. Because so many planners just cannot, or are unwilling to engage with the question of who counts with that, what matters.
Yeah, I can see that.
But there's sorry.
Just to kind of very specifically on that, yeah, this is why one of our aims is to kind of try and push the notion of planning for the arts, well, yeah, push it out. Introduce instead this notion of cultural production, which kind of frames then the, you know, establishment of the Latino kind of business as the same realm of kind of activity as the establishment of those artists, and that if planning for the arts is not as a byproduct or even as a core, creating conditions that support and protect those kind of possibilities for the establishment of the making visible of those migrant cultures through the kinds of activities that you highlight. If it's not kind of creating those conditions too, if planning for the arts is actually, you know, kind of just like leading to a deterioration of those conditions, then what's the point? You know, like it's not actually, you know, it's actually just kind of going to lead to an over-specialization in cities, which is going to lead to the loss of the kinds of jobs that we've shown, you know, are there and are so valuable. So these things, so that's why our kind of aim is to try and figure out what some of the common and fundamental conditions that are actually shared across those possibility, those spaces of possibility are, that those can then be focused on, rather than the kind of saying, well, we have to just take a creative space and put it there. Like,